No one cleans it for weeks, the cook casually said, oblivious to the man standing before him. Harlan froze. The words echoed in his ears as he stood in the restroom staring at the neglected mess, filthy floors, overflowing trash, a place so far removed from the polished image the company had built. It wasn't just a dirty restroom, it was a reflection of everything wrong with the company. Harlan had entered the company in an employee uniform, his cold gaze scanning the surroundings. No one recognized him. The employees worked around him with indifference, their actions mechanical, their eyes distant. The chaos in the kitchen, the clatter of plates, the heavy smell of grease had all blended together into a scene of neglect. The cook's words hit harder than any failure Harlan had imagined. This wasn't just about cleaning. This was about care, about the absence of it. And in that moment, Harlan realized the company was in far worse shape than he'd thought. The truth was unavoidable. Think you've seen it all. Think again, subscribe, and find out what happens next in this incredible story. Harlan observed her from a distance before approaching. Catherine moved quickly between tables, her face tired but her eyes burning with a quiet, unspoken desire for recognition. She worked tirelessly, weaving between customers with the practiced ease of someone who had long mastered the art of invisibility. The plates she carried were heavy, but it wasn't the weight of the dishes that seemed to burden her. It was the lack of acknowledgement, the way she disappeared into the background as if she was just a shadow in the room. Harlan watched her for a moment longer, his gaze lingering. Catherine's every step was deliberate, a kind of silent protest against being overlooked. She smiled when needed, nodded, and moved on, her expression never fully changing. But in the flicker of her eyes there was something more, something that told a story of unspoken frustrations and quiet sacrifices. "Do you enjoy this work?" Harlan asked, his voice gentle yet direct. Catherine hesitated, as if she had never been asked such a question. "I do," she replied, but there was a weight behind her words that betrayed her true feelings. The smile never quite reached her eyes. It was a subtle exchange, but in that moment, Harlan understood. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a worker, hidden in plain sight, always giving, but never truly seen. A contradiction of effort and neglect. The kitchen was intense, fast-paced, and suffocating. The clang of pots, the hiss of grills, the sharp sting of hot air mixed with the aroma of sizzling food. Harlan stepped inside, taking a deep breath as his eyes adjusted to the chaos. There was a man at the stove, moving with mechanical precision, flipping pans without sparing a glance at his surroundings. Mike, the head chef, stood tall and unwavering, his face set in a permanent scowl, his eyes narrowed with focus. Harlan approached him cautiously, noticing the distance that Mike kept from everyone else. The man was fast, efficient, but there was no warmth in his actions. It was as if he had become numb to the rhythm of the kitchen, drowning in the tasks at hand without any connection to those he worked with. "Hey, how's it going?" Harlan asked, trying to engage. Mike didn't look up. "Just another day," he muttered, his tone flat, almost dismissive. Harlan studied him, sensing something colder beneath the surface. Mike's movements were sharp, calculated. There was no joy, no passion in what he did. He was just going through the motions, trapped in his own world of isolation. The tension between them was palpable. Harlan had come here to understand, to feel, but Mike was a wall, a stark contrast to the openness Harlan had hoped to find. In that moment, the space between them felt infinite, and Harlan realized that Mike, like so many others here, had lost something vital in his work. Leah worked in the background, her actions invisible to most, but Harlan couldn't ignore her. She moved with the same mechanical precision as Mike, but instead of sizzling pans, she scrubbed floors, wiped down sinks, and cleaned the bathrooms no one else dared to enter. The space was dim, the smell of harsh cleaning chemicals hanging heavy in the air. Leah's face was drawn, her shoulders slumped under the weight of an endless cycle that seemed to have no end. She didn't speak much. In fact, she barely spoke at all. Her tasks were simple, and yet her exhaustion was palpable in every movement. The floors gleamed after she passed over them, but the work was never finished. The grime always returned. Harlan watched her for a while, his eyes following her as she moved from one task to the next, unnoticed by everyone. "How long have you been working here?" he asked, his voice softer this time. Leah paused, looking up at him for the first time, and there it was a brief flicker of recognition. "Long enough to know nothing changes," she replied, her voice low but carrying an unmistakable sadness. She went back to scrubbing without another word. It wasn't just the bathroom that needed cleaning. The company was dirty, too, and Leah, though her work was necessary, was as invisible as the stains she fought to remove. Harlan felt a pang in his chest. There was no justice in her efforts, no recognition for the work she did. Leah was just another part of the machine, but no one bothered to see how much it cost her. Harlan moved through the corridors, taking in the rhythm of the company as if it were a living organism and one that was sick. The floors gleamed in places, but bore scuff marks where no one bothered to sweep. Desks were littered with scraps of paper and half-empty coffee cups, the faint scent of grease clinging stubbornly to the air. Employees rushed past one another with indifferent expressions, murmuring instructions without eye contact or care. Each movement, each gesture seemed mechanical, devoid of pride or ownership. Harlan noticed a chair pushed crookedly against a counter, a streak of sauce dried across a tabletop, a floor mat frayed and stained. Nothing here suggested attention. Nothing suggested respect for either the work or the people doing it. His chest tightened, a low, simmering frustration building. The company he had shaped and nurtured now moved like a machine, missing key parts, productive in output, but hollow in humanity. Every careless action was amplified in his mind, the indifference of managers, the fatigue etched into employees' faces, the casual neglect of the environment itself. For the first time, Harlan felt the weight of the systemic failure pressing down not merely inefficiency, but a neglect so pervasive that it threatened to erode the very foundation of the company. He walked in silence, absorbing the subtle details of disorder, each one a testament to oversight and disregard, and felt the bitter sting of disappointment settle deep in his bones. He stepped into the restroom and paused, the air thick with a sour tang that made his stomach tighten. Tiles were streaked with grime, and paper towels littered the floor in chaotic disregard. The sinks bore dried water stains, faint fingerprints smeared across stainless steel. Even the mirrors reflected neglect, streaked cloudy, a dim echo of a place meant to be sanitary. The lighting cast long, cold shadows across the cracked floor, emphasizing the contrast between what should have been clean and what had been abandoned. Harlan's eyes traveled over the mess, each detail sharpening his awareness of how little attention had been given to spaces most essential for dignity. Every corner whispered a history of neglect, every mark a silent indictment of apathy. He drew in a shallow breath, the stink clinging stubbornly, and the enormity of the problem hit him like a wall. This wasn't simply a lapse, it was proof of systemic disregard. The filth was more than physical. It was a symptom of a culture that overlooked those who cared and rewarded those who ignored. Harlan's chest tightened further, a surge of frustration mixing with disbelief. He realized this could not be ignored. Change was not optional. Harlan returned to the kitchen, his gaze tracking Mike as he moved from stove to prep table. He watched the chef for a long moment, noting the slick grease on his hands and the careless placement of utensils. "Mike," he said, keeping his tone measured, "who's responsible for cleaning this area? The floors, the surfaces, the workstations." Mike paused briefly, not looking up. His expression was flat eyes, hard and unyielding. "No one," he said finally. "Anyone who does it for a day, then it's back to the same." Harlan absorbed the weight of the words. The flatness of Mike's voice carried no guilt, no shame, only resignation, a tacit acceptance of neglect. It was not just a reflection of Mike himself, but of a system that had allowed indifference to thrive. Harlan felt a cold wave of disappointment and a rising fire of frustration. The negligence was not accidental. It was cultivated, normalized, and ignored. His mind traced the implications: employees' unseen effort, wasted standards eroded. This simple confession, so matter-of-fact, made the rot visible. Harlan's jaw tightened as the reality settled in the company's greatest problem was not efficiency or profit, it was the erosion of care, of pride, of accountability. As Harlan made his way through the company, he encountered more employees, each one seemingly caught in their own silent struggle. A cook, his face lined with exhaustion, worked without looking up. A cashier, half-heartedly scanning items, let out a heavy sigh after every transaction. Their movements were slow, mechanical, and their eyes seemed empty, as if the weight of their work had drained them completely. He stopped to talk with a few, asking about their experiences. The answers came in hushed tones laden with frustration. "No one cares," one of them said. "They don't listen to us, just expect us to do the job, no questions asked." Another voice echoed, "We're just here to fill a spot." These weren't just words, they were the reality of workers who had given everything they could only to be met with indifference. It became clear to Harlan that this wasn't a case of laziness or negativity on the part of the employees. They were simply products of a broken system, overlooked and undervalued. The problem wasn't just the lack of effort, it was the lack of investment, the failure of leadership to see the value in its people. This realization weighed heavily on Harlan. These employees weren't the issue, those above them were. Harlan's sense of unease grew stronger as he ventured to the other parts of the company. The warehouse was no better than the restaurant floor. Boxes sat in disarray with workers slowly sorting through them, their attention fragmented by constant distractions. The back office was a maze of paperwork, disorganized and buried under the weight of neglect. No one seemed to care that the structure of the company was crumbling beneath their feet. Harlan's steps echoed as he walked through each department, each scene revealing the same theme: apathy, fatigue, and a lack of direction. He had hoped to find pockets of energy, of people trying to turn things around, but it wasn't there. The problems weren't isolated to one area. It was systemic, an illness that had spread across every corner of the company. As Harlan passed through each department, it became painfully obvious. The lack of motivation was contagious, infecting everyone from the lowest-level workers to the managers. No one was immune. This wasn't just a few bad apples, it was the entire orchard that had rotted from the inside out. His frustration deepened, and the weight of the situation became almost unbearable. Harlan sought out Leah once more. She was still cleaning, still working in the same quiet, resigned manner. She was alone in the back room, scrubbing at the same stubborn stains on the bathroom floor. The sight of her, dedicated but invisible, struck Harlan deeply. He approached her gently, his voice softer than before. "How are things going?" "Leah," he asked. She paused for a moment, then looked up at him, her eyes tired but filled with something else, something raw. "It's the same every day," she said. "I'm just here to clean up after everyone else and nobody notices." Her voice broke slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "They don't even acknowledge that this place needs fixing. I'm doing this, but nothing changes." The weight of her words settled over Harlan. It wasn't just the physical mess Leah was dealing with, it was the emotional toll of working in a place that didn't see her. She wasn't just cleaning floors, she was trying to scrub away the neglect, the lack of respect that had been ingrained in this company. Harlan felt the pain in her voice, the depth of her exhaustion. She wasn't just doing her job, she was surviving in an environment that refused to help her thrive. It became clear to Harlan that Leah's struggles weren't isolated either. The system had failed her too. And now, more than ever, he knew that change had to come from the top. Harlan didn't waste time. He found Mike in the kitchen, his hands working quickly but with the same cold detachment. The air was thick with the noise of the kitchen, clattering pans, sizzling oil, but to Harlan, it all felt distant. He couldn't ignore the growing frustration inside him any longer. "Mike," he began, his voice calm but firm. "Why is the hygiene issue still being ignored here? Who's responsible for it?" Mike paused, flipping a pan without looking up, and finally spoke, his words blunt. "No one does it because no one cares." The simplicity of the response hit Harlan harder than any rant could. There was no passion, no concern in Mike's voice, just an acceptance of the status quo. Mike wasn't angry, he wasn't defensive. He was resigned. The lack of care wasn't just the problem, it was the attitude that permeated everything. Harlan's frustration deepened. The employees weren't failing because they were incapable. They were failing because no one from the bottom to the top had bothered to instill a sense of responsibility. There was no urgency, no accountability, only indifference. Harlan felt the walls closing in and the enormity of the company's rot settled deeper into his gut. Mike had just laid it bare. The issue wasn't the employees. It was the entire culture that had been allowed to thrive. Harlan walked away from the kitchen, his mind swirling with Mike's words. The kitchen had been a microcosm of everything wrong with the company. He could still hear the distant sounds of dishes and orders being shouted out, but it all felt hollow. He found a quiet corner away from the chaos and leaned against a wall. His thoughts drifted back to the company's early days, how it had all started with such hope and ambition. The dream he'd poured everything into now felt like a distant memory slipping through his fingers. He thought of the faces he'd seen, the indifference, the apathy. None of it was what he had envisioned. How had it come to this? How had he let this happen? He stood there for a long time, the weight of failure pressing down on him. His own creation had become a place where no one cared. The employees were lost in a system that didn't value them, and the leadership had grown complacent too, focused on profits to notice the growing decay beneath them. Harlan felt his heart sink. He had built this, and now it was crumbling. But the question remained, how could he fix it? The answer was clear, and it terrified him. The tension inside Harlan was building a storm he could no longer ignore. He had seen enough, heard enough. The disillusionment had taken root in his chest, but now he knew what he had to do. He was no longer just an observer, he was part of the problem. As he sat quietly in his office, the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He would reveal himself. No more hiding, no more pretending to be just another employee. The stakes were too high now. He couldn't fix what was broken from the outside. It was time to show them who he really was. His hand hovered over his phone as he prepared to send a message to the team. What would their reaction be? Shock, disbelief, maybe even anger. It didn't matter. He was done standing on the sidelines. His company needed change, and it would have to start with them seeing the person they had all overlooked, the person who could make that change happen. He took a deep breath and steadied himself. It was time. His pulse quickened, not with fear, but with a rising sense of resolve. He was about to turn this all around. Harlan stood in front of the employees, his gaze steady but filled with an undeniable weight. The room fell silent as he took a deep breath, the words lingering in his chest for a moment before they finally escaped. "I'm not just another employee here," he said, his voice firm, yet surprisingly calm. "I'm the owner of this company." The shock was immediate, spreading like wildfire. Conversation stopped abruptly, eyes widened in disbelief. Mike, who had been leaning against the kitchen counter, froze, his mouth hanging slightly open as he processed the words. His hands trembled, and for the first time since Harlan had met him, his usual stoic expression faltered. The employees exchanged confused glances, some whispering, others just staring in stunned silence. No one had suspected. No one had even considered the possibility. Harlan saw the disbelief in their faces, and for a moment he wondered if this was the right time, the right way to reveal the truth. But the shock wasn't just from the revelation. It was the sudden realization that the person they had dismissed as just another worker was the one who had built this place. The air was thick with tension. Harlan knew what was coming. They hadn't expected this, and neither had he. But it was time. The company's future depended on it. The silence stretched long, the weight of the revelation settling on the room like a heavy fog. No one knew what to say. Some stood frozen, unsure of how to process the truth. Others shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking between Harlan and each other as if expecting someone else to react first. Mike was the first to speak, but his voice was a low murmur, disbelieving. "Wait. You." His eyes scanned Harlan's face, searching for any sign of a joke, but found none. The realization hit him like a freight train. The stoic chef who had remained unmoved by everything now stood utterly shaken. The others remained quiet, their faces a mix of confusion and embarrassment. They couldn't reconcile the man they had seen as just another worker with the man who had built the very place they called their job. There was no laughter, no joking, just the heavy, uncomfortable silence of realization. Harlan watched them, their discomfort palpable. Some looked at him with a sense of guilt, others with disbelief. It was a painful moment, Harlan had known it would be, but the weight of it was far more suffocating than he anticipated. What would they think of him now? What had they really thought of him all along? The room remained quiet, the tension hanging like an invisible thread between them. Harlan took a step forward, his eyes softening as he spoke again this time, more personal. I didn't come here to surprise you or cause chaos. I came because I need you to understand what this company was meant to be, what I meant for it to be. He paused, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. But it hasn't turned out the way I planned. There was no bravado in his voice now, no shield, just raw honesty. I made mistakes, big ones. I got caught up in numbers, in expansion, in profits. I forgot about what made this place what it was supposed to be. The employees listened intently, some still unsure, others leaning in, captivated by the honesty in his words. I pushed for growth, but I never took the time to grow with you all. I was blind to what was happening on the ground level. His voice faltered slightly as he continued. And for that, I'm sorry. His confession was met with silence, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was a pause, an acknowledgement. Harlan's vulnerability wasn't a sign of weakness. It was an invitation to heal, to rebuild. He wasn't just the owner anymore. He was a man who had failed and now sought redemption. It was a turning point both for him and for the company. Harlan stood before the team, his gaze unwavering, no longer the man who had walked in unnoticed. He was different now. The weight of the company's failures pressed on his shoulders, but it also sparked a fire inside him, one he could no longer ignore. I'm not here just to apologize, he said, his voice firm. I'm here to change everything, to fix what's been broken. This company has become something I never intended, and I take full responsibility for that. But from now on, things will be different. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The employees exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to believe him. But there was a determination in Harlan's eyes, something raw, a promise that felt heavier than any corporate slogan. We will change the environment, the culture, the way we treat each other. I will make sure that every single person here feels valued and respected. This is a new beginning, and I'm committed to seeing it through. His declaration rippled through the room, and for the first time the employees saw him not just as a boss but as a leader willing to step into the mess and fix it. The atmosphere shifted, a subtle sense of hope creeping in. Harlan's commitment wasn't just a promise, it was the spark that could ignite the change they desperately needed. The question was, would they trust him to follow through? After the declaration, Harlan's next move was to show his sincerity. He knew words alone wouldn't be enough. He had to act. As he stood before the team again, a new energy filled the room. I know some of you have been working tirelessly, putting in more than anyone noticed, he began. And for that, I want to show my appreciation. He turned to Catherine, Mike, and Leah, calling them out by name, and the room fell into an expectant silence. You've been the heart of this company even when you weren't acknowledged. Today, you will be recognized for your dedication. With that, he handed each of them an envelope, bonuses, rewards they had long since stopped hoping for. Catherine's eyes widened in disbelief, Mike's stoic demeanor cracked for a moment, and Leah stood frozen, unsure how to respond. They had never expected this kind of recognition. The applause from their co-workers echoed through the room, but it wasn't just for the money. It was for the validation they had all been craving, something real, something that said, "We see you." The reward wasn't just financial. It was a statement. It was proof that change had begun. and that alone was enough to ignite a flicker of hope in the eyes of those who had felt invisible for so long. Harlan's actions were just the beginning. He didn't want to stop with rewards. The foundation of change had to start with a commitment to bettering the environment. "We're going to make real changes," he said, his voice resolute. "First, we're raising wages. No one here should feel undervalued. We will also improve your benefits, and we'll start by offering more flexible hours and more time off for those who need it. This is just the start, but it's an important one." As he spoke, the employees listened intently, the weight of his words sinking in. The promises were clear, tangible, and for once they didn't feel like empty corporate jargon. Leah exchanged a glance with Catherine, her eyes filled with a cautious optimism. Mike, who had been distant until now, looked slightly less tense. They hadn't expected these changes to happen so quickly or so comprehensively. The news was a jolt of energy. The atmosphere in the room shifted from skepticism to cautious hope. For the first time in a long while, the employees felt like their voices had been heard. This wasn't just a company-wide policy, it was a lifeline. And it was exactly what they needed to rebuild trust in the leadership. Harlan had done more than speak about change. He had shown them it could be real. It was subtle at first, the shift in attitude, but Harlan could see it happening. The morning rush started like every other day, but this time there was a different energy in the air. Catherine was moving faster, her smile brighter as she served customers with a newfound enthusiasm. Mike, usually focused only on the food, glanced at the team and gave a nod of acknowledgement before diving back into his work. Leah was cleaning with a sense of pride, her movements purposeful as she polished the countertops. The atmosphere felt different, less fragmented, more cohesive. The changes were small, but they were there in the way the employees interacted with each other. They weren't just going through the motions anymore. They were starting to care not because they were asked to, but because they were beginning to believe in what Harlan had promised. There was a unity that hadn't existed before. For the first time, they weren't working against each other. They were working with each other. Harlan watched quietly, taking in the subtle but powerful transformation. It was proof that the shift wasn't just about policies or rewards. It was about trust. The environment was changing, and with it, the people who made it all happen. Harlan felt a flicker of hope. This was just the beginning. Later that afternoon, Harlan called Catherine into his office. She walked in cautiously, unsure of what to expect, but the warmth in his eyes reassured her. He motioned for her to sit, and as she did, he paused, considering the right words. "Catherine," he began, "you've worked here longer than most, and you've always given more than anyone asked. I see that. You've shown dedication, and it hasn't gone unnoticed." Catherine's eyes widened, a mix of disbelief and hope flickering across her face. She had never expected to be recognized like this, certainly not in a company where hard work often went unacknowledged. "I want to offer you a promotion," Harlan continued. "You've earned it. I'd like to see you step into a management role." The words sank in slowly as Catherine absorbed the reality of what he was offering. It wasn't just a job, it was a chance to finally be seen to take her place where she belonged. A tear threatened to fall, but she blinked it away, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It wasn't just a position she was gaining. It was a moment of recognition she had longed for. She had always worked hard for this moment, but never imagined it would come like this. Harlan had given her more than a promotion, he had given her hope. Harlan knew that improving the environment wasn't enough. He needed to ensure that every employee had the skills to thrive, to feel confident and empowered in their roles. So he introduced a new initiative, a comprehensive training program focused on communication, customer care, and leadership skills. It wasn't just about making employees better at their jobs, it was about giving them the tools they needed to succeed both personally and professionally. "Starting next week, we'll be implementing a training program for everyone," Harlan explained to the staff. "I believe in you all, and I want to make sure you have everything you need to excel in your roles." The room was silent at first, the employees processing the idea. Some exchanged glances, unsure of what to expect, but there was an underlying current of curiosity. This wasn't just another mandate, it was a sign that Harlan was committed to their growth, that their development mattered to him. Leah looked up, her expression softening as she realized that Harlan wasn't just offering more work. He was offering a chance to improve, to be better. For the first time, they felt like they were part of something bigger than just a job. Harlan was giving them the opportunity to transform not only their work, but their lives. The air felt lighter, as if the weight of the past had started to lift. The program was the first step in a journey they hadn't anticipated, but now they were eager to begin. The transformation was subtle, yet undeniable. It began with the small things. Catherine took a few extra moments to wipe down the tables, her movements more deliberate, more attentive. Mike, usually focused on his kitchen station, paused long enough to ask the dishwasher if they needed help carrying trays of dishes. Leah, usually silent, now smiled as she greeted the customers, her expression warmer than it had ever been. It wasn't much, but it was everything. It was in these small actions that the true change began to show. The workstations, once cluttered and chaotic, were now organized. The restrooms, once neglected, were kept clean throughout the day. Employees who once barely looked at each other now exchanged nods of recognition, offering help without being asked. The subtle shift was evident in the way customers were treated with more respect, the effort put into each task, no matter how small. Each act of cooperation, each moment of care reflected the foundation Harlan had laid. It wasn't grand gestures that defined the change, it was the consistent effort in the everyday work that made all the difference. Harlan noticed it most in the small smiles, the subtle increase in energy, and the newfound sense of pride in the employees' work. The company was no longer the same place it had been just weeks ago. These small actions, big in their impact, spoke volumes. Harlan spent days observing, moving through the departments with a quiet sense of purpose. What he had hoped for was now unfolding before him. The sense of doubt, the uncertainty in the employees' eyes that had once been so prevalent had begun to fade. It was replaced by something else, something Harlan hadn't expected so quickly. Employees worked with more care, more collaboration. There was an unspoken unity between the kitchen staff and servers, now a shared responsibility that had been missing before. The conversations around the water cooler weren't just complaints anymore. They were plans, discussions, ideas for how to improve even further. From the break room to the front counter, the energy was different. The atmosphere was still busy, still chaotic at times, but there was a distinct sense of purpose in the air. Employees weren't just clocking in anymore, they were engaging, helping each other, and putting more effort into their tasks. The work had gained meaning once more. Harlan stood back and watched the weight of his actions beginning to sink in. The company wasn't just operating more efficiently, it was thriving on a new energy. This was what he had been waiting for. This was the moment where real change was no longer just a promise, it was reality. One morning, Harlan made a decision that would further solidify the bond he had started to build with his employees. Instead of staying behind his office door, he walked into the kitchen, rolling up his sleeves to help with the prep work. He didn't announce it, didn't make a speech about it. He simply joined in, standing side by side with the team. At first, the employees glanced at him in surprise, but soon the awkwardness faded. Harlan moved between stations, helping slice vegetables, clearing counter space, and checking on orders. He wasn't just overseeing anymore. He was part of the team. His presence in the kitchen wasn't just symbolic, it was genuine. He worked alongside Mike, watching his precise movements, asking questions. He joined Leah during her shift, chatting lightly as they moved through the tasks together. There was no hierarchy now, just a shared experience of work. This wasn't about Harlan leading from the front anymore. It was about him connecting with the people who had made this company what it was. And as they worked together, the distance that had once existed between him and his employees melted away. It was no longer just about him making decisions. It was about being present, being part of the process. In those moments, Harlan saw the real power of collaboration, and for the first time in a long while he felt truly connected to the heart of his company. Weeks had passed since Harlan implemented his reforms, and the transformation in the company was evident. As he walked through the same hallways, he felt a shift in the atmosphere, lighter, more purposeful. He observed the employees, their movements more fluid, their expressions less burdened. Catherine no longer rushed through her tasks. There was a calm determination in her steps. Mike, who had once seemed closed off, now shared a few words with his team, his earlier sternness replaced by collaboration. Leah, her smile brighter, greeted customers with an ease that hadn't been there before. Harlan stopped for a moment, watching them interact. There was no mistaking it. The change was real. It wasn't just about the tasks getting done. It was about the people behind those tasks. The cynicism had lifted, replaced by a quiet pride in their work. It was more than Harlan had hoped for. He'd given them the tools, but they had chosen to build. He felt an overwhelming sense of satisfaction as he looked around the space that had once felt suffocating, now humming with life. The impact of his decisions was visible in every corner. He had done what he set out to do, not just improve the company, but restore something more important: belief. Later that day, Harlan stood at the back of the dining room as the employees gathered for a brief meeting. The room was quieter than usual, and there was a stillness in the air. It was Leah who spoke first, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, looking directly at Harlan, "for believing in us, for seeing us." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Catherine nodded in agreement. "It's not just the pay or the rewards," she added. "It's the respect, the fact that we're not just numbers anymore. You've changed everything for us." The others nodded, murmuring in agreement. There was no grand speech, just genuine appreciation. The gratitude was evident in their eyes, in the way they stood taller, in the way their shoulders were no longer burdened by invisible weight. Harlan felt a lump rise in his throat, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. This was what he had hoped for, not just a transformation in the company, but in them. They weren't just employees now. They were partners. His commitment had been met with their trust, and that meant everything. He had done more than lead them through change, he had earned their respect. As the meeting ended, Harlan lingered, his gaze following Leah and Catherine as they moved to the kitchen. There was still more he needed to do, more he could offer. It wasn't just about work anymore. He had watched them struggle, seen the weight they carried outside the workplace. He could do more. He could help them on a personal level. Later that afternoon, he called Leah and Catherine into his office, where he sat them down. "I know you've been through a lot," he began, his voice softer than usual. "And I want to help, not just in the workplace, but in your lives outside of it. If there's anything I can do, whether it's with family bills, anything, I'm here to support you." Leah looked stunned, her eyes welling up as she fought to hold back tears. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice trembling. Catherine, equally surprised, found her words. "Thank you, Harlan. You don't know what this means. It wasn't just about giving them a job or even a promotion. It was about showing them that they were valued as people, not just workers." Harlan had always believed in the power of community, but now he understood it more deeply than ever. His support wasn't just financial. It was a gesture of compassion, a promise to be there for them both inside and outside the walls of the company. This wasn't just business anymore. It was personal, and it was real. It wasn't just the employees who were starting to believe in the change. The senior management team was finally on board, too. At the weekly leadership meeting, Harlan stood at the head of the table, his demeanor calm but resolute. The usual tension that had once permeated the room was now gone. Instead, there was a sense of unity as each manager began to voice their support for the new direction. "We've seen real improvements on the ground," said the head of operations, nodding. "The staff are more engaged. There's a noticeable shift in the atmosphere, and it's time we acknowledge it." Another manager chimed in. "We need to build on this momentum. Let's make sure the changes aren't just surface level." Harlan listened as his colleagues spoke the words he'd longed to hear, now filling the air. For so long there had been hesitation and resistance from those at the top, but now they were all in agreement. Their support wasn't just in words, it was in the action that followed. They understood now that the success of the company depended not on profits alone, but on creating a culture where every individual felt valued. The sense of solidarity was palpable. The managers who had once been fragmented in their approach now stood united. Harlan felt a surge of relief. This was no longer just his battle, it was everyone's. The groundwork was laid, and the company had a future built on cooperation and trust. The change within the company became even more evident as the days passed. The employees, once apathetic and worn out, now approached their work with a renewed energy. It wasn't just the physical tasks that were changing, but the way they were performed. The employees began to greet each other with more warmth, helping one another without being asked, and collaborating more freely. There was a sense of camaraderie in the air, something that hadn't been there before. Mike, who had often kept to himself, now worked side by side with the new staff, offering guidance when needed. Catherine made sure to check in with her coworkers not just to help, but to engage in meaningful conversation. Leah, always quiet before now, smiled at customers as they entered, her confidence growing with each passing day. The change was palpable. Customers began to notice the shift, too. Their experiences improved not just by faster service, but by the genuine friendliness of the staff. The positive atmosphere became contagious, spreading throughout the restaurant and the office. What was once a place of resentment and apathy had transformed into a space of teamwork and respect. Harlan observed the change with a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't just about efficiency, it was about creating an environment where employees wanted to give their best. And they were doing just that. The company was thriving again, not just through policies, but through the renewed spirit of its people. A few weeks later, Harlan called for an all-hands meeting, gathering everyone from the kitchen to the office. The room was filled with anticipation. Employees who had once doubted the changes now looked to him with eager expectation. Harlan stood before them, his voice steady, his confidence unmistakable. "We've made a lot of progress," he began. "But this is just the beginning. I want you all to understand that the changes we're making now are for the long term. We're not just building a company. We're building a community, a future where every one of you plays an essential role." He spoke about the company's goals for the next 5 years, how they would focus on sustainability, employee growth, and expanding their impact in the community. He talked about new initiatives, including leadership training and career development opportunities. But more importantly, he shared his vision: a company where everyone, no matter their position, felt like they were part of something larger than themselves. The room was silent for a moment, the gravity of his words settling in. And then, as if on cue, there was a soft ripple of applause. Harlan felt a surge of pride as he looked around at the faces of the people who had helped make this possible. They weren't just employees anymore, they were partners in shaping the future. As the meeting closed, the employees gathered in small groups discussing the vision Harlan had laid out. There was a palpable sense of unity. The direction was clear, and for the first time in a long while, everyone seemed to be moving toward the same goal. Harlan stood by the window looking out at the bustling company floor below his eyes, scanning the familiar space that had changed so much. The chaos he had first walked into was now replaced with a sense of order, a rhythm to the work that hadn't been there before. Employees moved purposefully, their attitudes different, focused, motivated, and more connected. Catherine smiled as she helped a new waiter, Mike calmly guided his team in the kitchen, and Leah spoke with a customer, her confidence evident. He took a deep breath, a quiet sense of pride swelling in his chest. This was what he had worked for, what he had fought for. The company that had once been fragmented, disjointed, and apathetic now seemed to have found its heartbeat. The atmosphere had shifted from one of exhaustion to one of engagement. The employees weren't just working for a paycheck anymore, they were working for something bigger, something that mattered. Harlan knew there was still much to be done, but the foundations were in place. He had transformed the culture, rebuilt trust, and in the process reignited the spark within each individual. It was a victory not just for him, but for everyone in the company. He had given them the tools to rebuild, and they had done it together. Harlan felt the weight of the journey lift from his shoulders. His work here was far from over, but today he allowed himself a moment to savor the success. Later that week, Harlan stood before the team one last time, his heart full of gratitude for the changes he had witnessed. He had led them through tough times, but now it was their turn to carry the torch. This journey has been difficult. He began, his voice steady, but I'm proud of every one of you for the strength and resilience you've shown. You've proven that with effort and determination, anything is possible. The employees listened intently, their eyes fixed on him as he continued. But I want you to remember something. Success isn't just about the company, the bottom line, or the promotions. It's about you, the person you become in the process. The challenges you face are what shape you, not just as an employee, but as a person. He paused, letting his words settle. Don't be afraid to fail and never stop pushing forward. You're all capable of so much more than you realize. Keep growing, keep learning, and most importantly, never forget that the work you do here matters not just to the company, but to the world. Harlan's words weren't just a closing speech, they were a call to action. He had given them the tools to succeed, but now it was up to them to take ownership of their growth. As he finished speaking, he saw the fire in their eyes, the quiet determination that had been kindled. They were ready for whatever came next. As the days passed, Harlan found himself reflecting on the journey. The lessons he had learned were invaluable more than just about business, they were about people. He had come into this process thinking he was going to fix the company, but what he had learned was that it was the people who needed to be fixed first. The company wasn't just a set of processes and systems. It was a group of individuals, each with their own hopes, dreams, and struggles. He thought back to his early days with the company, to the mistakes he had made, focusing too much on profits, losing sight of the human element. He had been blind to the needs of his employees, to their frustrations and their potential. But now he understood. It wasn't enough to lead with authority. It was about leading with compassion, understanding, and a commitment to the growth of each person. The changes had come not from a shift in strategy or a new set of policies, but from a deeper, more personal understanding of what it meant to be a leader. Harlan smiled softly to himself. In many ways, this journey had been more about his own growth than anyone else's. And in that, he had found the true meaning of leadership. It wasn't about being in charge, it was about helping others rise. As the days went by, the changes became clearer to the employees. During lunch breaks and after shifts, they began talking to each other, sharing their thoughts on how different the company had become. I actually look forward to coming in now, Mike said one afternoon, shaking his head with a small smile. I don't remember the last time I felt like this about work. Catherine, overhearing him, nodded in agreement. It's not just the work either. It's the way we're treated. I feel like I matter now. Leah, who had remained mostly silent in the past, spoke up one day as well. It's been a long time since I felt valued. But now I do. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of a transformation that had been years in the making. The change wasn't just in the tasks they performed or the way they interacted with customers. It was in their pride and confidence. This was no longer just a job, it was a place where they could see themselves growing. The company had become somewhere they wanted to stay to build a future. And they weren't just employees, they were contributors to something real. Sitting in his office, Harlan let the quiet of the room surround him. The weight of the past months pressed gently on his shoulders, but now it felt like a weight he could bear with pride. Looking out over the company he had rebuilt, he realized that joining Undercover Boss had been the best decision he'd ever made. It wasn't just about seeing his company from a different perspective, it was about understanding it truly, understanding the people who made it all work. He thought about his initial hesitations, the doubts he had before going undercover. It had been a gamble, but in the end, it had reshaped not only the company but also his view of leadership. He hadn't just changed the company, he had changed himself. His approach, his priorities, his relationship with his employees, all of it had evolved. The journey had been as much about self-discovery as it had been about company reform. Harlan felt a deep sense of pride. He had taken the hardest steps and had emerged a better leader, ready for whatever came next. Standing in the heart of the company he had transformed, Harlan knew it was no longer the place it once was. The energy, the pride, the satisfaction in every corner, it was all real. He watched his employees working with purpose genuinely engage their eyes alight with something they had lost long ago: hope. This wasn't just a business anymore, it was a thriving ecosystem of individuals who mattered. Harlan's decisions had shaped this moment. The results weren't just visible, they were tangible. His company had been reborn, and in this moment it was thriving. He had done more than change a company. He had created a legacy,